So welcome everyone, I'm Mary Imperato. I'm assistant professor and chair of the politics department here at Belmont Abbey. And it's great to have you all here tonight for this inaugural lecture for Belmont Abbey's Intercollegiate Studies Institute chapter, the Abbey Political Thought Society. For those students out there, if you're interested in thoughtful conversations about liberty and democracy, and if you want to help plan events and bring speakers to campus or attend ISI conferences, then you should reach out to our chapter leaders. President is Nicholas von Spakovsky, and the VP is Youth and Love. They're back there. They're going to be handing out some little flyers that are going to go with the talk. And they'll be at the back of the room after the talk if you want to find out more about the ISI chapter that's starting up here. So we are really grateful to the Intercollegiate Studies Institute for their sponsorship of this event. And we're also very appreciative of Hans von Spakovsky, for our guest tonight, for making the trip out here to the Abbey again. And I say again because our speaker is actually an honorary member of the Abbey family. His nephew, Nicholas von Spakovsky, is a junior in politics and great books, and his niece, Alexis, is an Abbey alum, as well as current adjunct instructor in politics. So thank you, Mr. von Spakovsky, for coming to share your expertise on this vital issue of election integrity at this critical time before our midterm elections. When I teach the introductory American government course here, we often talk about the difference between direct democracy and representative democracy. And we note that representative democracy only works when it has open, free elections with genuine competition so that voters have a meaningful choice. We point to Putin's Russia as an example of a regime that doesn't seem to have open and fair elections, and so would not qualify as a representative democracy. In America, we have prided ourselves on being a beacon of democracy in the world, in part because people hold their leaders accountable here through elections. With recent elections clouded in controversy and accusations of fraud, however, perhaps we have cause for concern. How can we shore up and build trust in our elections, that indispensable pillar of our democracy? To help us address this issue, we are happy to be joined by Hans von Spakovsky. As a senior legal fellow in the Heritage Foundation's Edwin and East Center for Legal and Judicial Studies, he is an authority on a wide range of issues, including civil rights, the First Amendment, immigration, the rule of law, and government reform. He also directs Heritage's Election Law Reform Initiative, where he studies campaign finance restrictions, voter fraud and voter ID, enforcement of federal voting rights laws, administration of elections, and voting equipment standards. He is the co-author with John Fund of the 2012 book, Who's Counting? How Fraudsters and Bureaucrats Put Your Vote at Risk, and the 2021 book, Our Broken Elections, How the Left Changed the Way You Vote. In 2017, President Donald Trump appointed von Spakovsky to the Presidential Advisory Commission on Election Integrity. Before joining the Heritage Foundation in 2008, he served 2 years as a member of the Federal Election Commission, the authority charged with enforcing campaign finance laws for congressional and presidential elections. Previously, von Spakovsky worked at the Justice Department as counsel to the Assistant Attorney General for Civil Rights, providing expertise in enforcing the Voting Rights Act and the Help America Vote Act of 2002. His analysis and commentary have appeared in the Wall Street Journal, the Washington Times, The Hill, and USA Today, as well as such outlets as National Review Online and Fox News. His series for PJ Media, Every Single One, was nominated for a Pulitzer Prize. He holds a law degree from Vanderbilt University and a bachelor's degree from Massachusetts Institute of Technology. Please join me in welcoming Hans von Spakovsky.
All right, can everybody hear me okay? Okay, good. I want to thank ISI and Mary Imperato for inviting me here. And I want to compliment you on upholding a great American tradition that is virtually disappearing in this country, particularly on college campuses. And that is the ability to have open, civil debates and discussions about issues even when they don't agree with the prevailing political orthodoxy. And that is very important to maintaining our democratic republic. How many students are in the audience? All right, before I talk about election integrity, I want to be sure, let me take care of one piece of business, which is I want to be sure you know about the Heritage Foundation's internship program. Okay, the Heritage Foundation is one of the biggest think tanks in America. It's probably the biggest conservative think tank in the world, and we have an internship program. I've had a lot of people tell me it's the best in Washington for 3 reasons. One, you do real work. If you do a congressional internship, you may end up fetching coffee and making photocopies. You don't do that at the Heritage Foundation. I have an intern right now. He's doing research for me. He's helping me write
articles and op-eds, and that is the kind of work you would do at the Heritage Foundation. Second, we pay our interns. Okay, a lot of people in Washington these days think you should just have volunteers, and we don't believe in that. We believe you should get paid for the work you do. And third, which is very important, Washington, D.C. is a very expensive place to live, and we provide housing for our interns. So there's a handout back there on the program, and we have both a summer, fall, and spring program. And no matter what your interests are, you could end up in the legal center working with me. You could end up in our domestic policy area, our national security area, our foreign policy area, just depending on what your interests are. So I hope you all will apply for that. I'm going to try to make 3 points today. The first is that election fraud, unfortunately, does occasionally occur in America. Now, the media will tell you you don't need to worry about it because it either never happens or it's just so rare that we don't need to do anything about it. And I'm going to tell you that's just wrong. Second, we can improve our election process. All you have to do is put in fundamental changes, make improvements, none of which are going to prevent people who are eligible from being able to vote. And a lot of the things that we need to do are just common sense. What voters want when you talk to them, and I talk to a lot of people on this issue, is they want two things out of elections. They want both access and they want security. And anyone who tells you that one cancels out the other, that if you provide access, you can't have security, or if you provide security, you're not going to have access, that is just not the case at all. It is not, as Mary and I were talking about, it's not a zero-sum game. And third, the claim that you see in the media and elsewhere that there has been a wave of voter suppression going on in the United States is also just not true. The idea that a common sense reform like voter ID is voter suppression just isn't the case. You know, one of the biggest people who's been making this claim now for years, of course, is Stacey Abrams in Georgia. I don't know if you all saw about a week or so ago, her lawsuit that she'd been pushing for a couple of years got thrown out of court. A judge ruled that all of her claims of things like requiring an ID is discriminatory or verifying the citizenship of registered voters is discriminatory. The judge threw it out and said, there's no evidence that any of that is discriminatory. And by the way, that judge who threw out her case in a 288-page opinion, y'all don't need to read it, I get paid to do that, is a judge appointed by Barack Obama. So this wasn't some conservative judge just tossing it out. And 288 pages, he goes through her claims in great detail. Now, how many of y'all have ever been to Mount Vernon in Washington, D.C.? Okay, well, if you went there recently, you will have noticed that a couple of years ago, the ladies who run Mount Vernon discovered in the archives George Washington's whiskey recipe. So they entered into a contract with Jim Beam, and they built a small distillery on the site where George Washington made his whiskey, and you can now buy whiskey there according to George Washington's formula. Now, it is very expensive. I didn't think it was very good, but the reason I mention this is because the first time George Washington ran for the House of Burgess, which is a state legislature in Virginia, it's the oldest functioning legislature in the Northern Hemisphere. He did something that was apparently traditional at the time. He provided free whiskey to voters so they would vote for him. Okay? James Madison, the first time he ran, thought this was unethical and a disgusting practice, and he refused to do it. Now, which of those two do you think got elected in their first election? George Washington, James Madison lost. Now, you all know that there's been a huge push to increase absentee ballots and have everybody voting by mail. Do you know why we have absentee ballots in this country? Most of Europe doesn't allow them because they had too many concerns about fraud. The reason we have absentee ballots in this country is because of the 1864 presidential election. Abraham Lincoln was facing a very tough re-election. They wasn't sure he was going to get re-elected. The Democratic candidate, you may remember, was George McClellan, his former general, who was running as a Democrat. And remember, McClellan was pushing the idea of an armistice. He wanted to end the war, which would have split the United States into two countries, and slavery would have continued for who knows how long. But the Republicans and Abraham Lincoln had a big problem. All of their men were where? In the field fighting. They could not be home on election day to vote. So they came up with the idea of absentee ballots, and just 2 years ago, the Washington Post, of all papers, did a whole story about a huge case of absentee ballot fraud that was discovered in the Lincoln election. Because it turned out that Horatio Seymour, who was the governor of New York, hated Abraham Lincoln. And he wanted George McClellan to win. And so he set up this whole scheme whereby officers in New York regiments were basically stealing the ballots of ordinary soldiers, particularly wounded veterans, and filling out their ballots and forging their signatures. And the only reason this was discovered was because the Republicans heard something about this and sent somebody down, and the whole thing was uncovered. So we had fraud the very first time absentee ballots were ever used in this country. In 1985, the U.S. Justice Department prosecuted the largest election fraud case it has ever prosecuted. And the only reason they found out about it was, this is a great lesson in if you make a campaign promise, you really should keep it. After Election Day, a upset poll worker called the FBI field office. Now, the reason I know all this, because I wrote a case study about this, and I actually ended up interviewing the U.S. attorney in Chicago and the head of the FBI field office, who's now retired. This poll worker called up the FBI office and said, there was a lot of fraud in the last election. This was a governor's race. And it turned out that he had been promised that if he helped stuff ballot boxes on election day, he would get a city job after the election. So he did that, but after election day, he was told, you're not going to get that job. So this started a grand jury investigation. It got so big that the entire FBI field office in Chicago was involved in the investigation. And knowing the history of Chicago, the FBI field office in Chicago is one of the largest in the country. And what's interesting about this case is that they ended up prosecuting over 60 individuals, convicted all of them, for engaging in every kind of fraud you can imagine. Everything from stuffing fraudulent ballots into ballot boxes to paying people to go vote, to putting in fraudulent ballots. As an example, the FBI office obtained from the state of Illinois a list of everybody who was in the state prison, in the penitentiaries there, and they compared it to the voter list, and they found all these individuals who apparently sitting in the state penitentiary had actually voted in Chicago. So it was one thing after another. The U.S. attorney estimated there had been 100,000 fraudulent ballots cast in that election, and they came within about 5,000 votes of overturning the governor's race. I tell you that story because you often hear people saying who are against election reform that the whole point of this, you're trying to suppress votes. You're particularly trying to suppress the votes of black Americans. Do you know what happened after that indictment by the grand jury? And the grand jury report was published. Most grand jury reports are secret. They thought this was so important for people to know what was happening in Chicago, how this machine had operated, that the grand jury report was made public. I have a copy of it in my office. Because of that fraud, because of those convictions, in the next city election, the U.S. attorney, a guy named Dan Webb, told all of the attorneys and FBI agents he wanted all of them to be poll watchers in precincts throughout the city. And what happened? Harold Washington, the first black mayor ever, was elected in Chicago. So what that shows you is that the machine that was operating was actually suppressing black voters and black candidates. And once they were prosecuted and convicted, it opened up the polls. In 1997, and you see we're advancing through the decades, right? In 1997, and I tell you this story because it tells you how the media has changed. You know, today, if you talk about fraud, you're immediately labeled as a crazy conspiracy guy. In 1997, the Miami Herald won a Pulitzer Prize for its investigation of the Miami mayor's race. They put 20 reporters on this, and they uncovered fraud throughout the city. Everything from people registering to vote in Miami who didn't actually live there, to people being paid to vote, to absentee ballot fraud. It ended up in a court case. The judge overturned the election and estimated that at least 5,000 fraudulent ballots had been cast in the election. There's no paper around today that'll get into that kind of investigation. That court case only happened because those reporters got out there and investigated the case. Now, again, going back to what I was talking about before, in 2004, the Indiana State Supreme Court issued a decision in another voter fraud case in East Chicago, Indiana. East Chicago, unfortunately, people there follow the traditions of the city of Chicago. There was apparently mass absentee ballot fraud in a Democratic mayoral election. And that's one of the things you find when you look at actual proven cases of fraud. A lot of people always think it's one party stealing from another. There's a lot of cases where it's people within the same party stealing from each other. And the East Chicago case is an example of this. That the election was overturned because of absentee ballot fraud. The Indiana State Supreme Court upheld it, but one of the most interesting things about it was the court said, who were the people who were targeted? Who were the people whose votes were stolen? And what they said was that the conspiracy, the folks participating in this conspiracy engaged in a predatory pattern. That was the court's words. And who were they targeting? Quote, first-time voters or otherwise less informed voters or those lacking a knowledge of the voting process, the infirm, the poor, and those with limited skills in the English language. What you find in many of these cases where it's organized fraud, it's not just one, look, there's lots of cases where you have one person who sees a security hole and commits fraud. An example of that is a number of cases we have that I've seen in North Carolina of aliens registering and voting, which is illegal, of people voting in the names of a dead relative. But organized fraud often targets minority neighborhoods and the poor. In 2012, 4 locals were convicted in Troy, New York, of engaging in absentee ballot fraud. And what they were doing was they were going into a particular neighborhood and stealing absentee ballots out of the mailboxes of people who lived there. And in many instances, they actually were sending in requests for absentee ballots. They had forged the signatures of the voters and had the absentee ballots sent to them. And when they were interviewed by the local police, they asked them, well, why did you target this neighborhood? It was a low-income neighborhood. And what the consultant, one of the political consultants who was convicted said was, well, this was a neighborhood in which we figured these people would be least likely to complain and least likely to notice that their ballot had been stolen. Now, I don't have to tell y'all that sometimes you have isolated fraud, other times you have organized fraud that overturns an election. You had that in North Carolina 4 years ago in the 9th Congressional District, an election decided by 900 votes in which your state board of elections did a very in-depth investigation, interviewed many witnesses, and overturned the election because of an organized effort to engage in election fraud. 4 of the people involved in that just recently pleaded guilty to fraud. And here's a quote from the North Carolina's report. It's very extensive. I read it. They said the evidence of absentee ballot fraud was, quote unquote, overwhelming. And the reason they overturned the election was because it was, quote, corrupted by fraud, improprieties, irregularities so pervasive that its results are tainted. If you want another example of an election being overturned because of fraud, this summer, Compton, California. I'm sure none of the older people have seen it, but some of the younger folks in here have probably seen the movie Straight Outta Compton. Okay, well, at Compton, they just overturned a city council race. The candidate won by 1 vote. And the judge overturned it because half a dozen individuals, all of whom have pleaded guilty, they all registered to vote in Compton, even though they don't live in Compton. So that was enough fraud to overturn the election. By the way, one of the people who pleaded guilty to fraud was the city council member who won the race by 1 vote, and several of the individuals had registered to vote at his home. I got so tired of hearing the editorial pages of the New York Times and the Washington Post and other papers say, there's no election fraud in the country, that a couple of years ago, we started an election fraud database at the Heritage Foundation. There's a push card back there that's got the website for it. You can go to our website, you can click on a map, pull up any state, and it'll show you a list of proven voter fraud cases. Now, when I say proven, I mean proven. We don't put any cases in there where somebody says, well, I think I saw this or I think I saw that. The only cases we put in there are cases where somebody's been convicted in a court of law, a judge has ordered a new election because of fraud, or you've had an official finding like by the State Board of Elections in North Carolina overturning an election because of fraud. We're up to almost 1,400 proven cases, recent cases. We're following another 100 prosecutions that haven't made it all the way to the end of the case. And every kind of fraud you can imagine is in there. Now, I checked North Carolina before I came down. We've got more than 36 cases in North Carolina, convictions for everything from voting by aliens, felons, and people who don't actually live in North Carolina, absentee ballot fraud, voter registration fraud, double voting, individuals voting in the name of deceased voters, and bribery, paying voters to vote. Now, if you think that old-fashioned ballot stuffing doesn't go on anymore, Google this name, Michael Ozzie Myers. The young students in this room won't remember this, but in the 1970s, the FBI set up a sting operation in Washington, D.C. It came to be known as ABSCAM. And an FBI agent dressed up and put on a disguise as if he was an Arab sheik. And they went to various members of Congress and offered them cash bribes to vote for particular pieces of legislation. And they videotaped it all. I think it was 7 members of Congress accepted the bribes and were prosecuted and convicted, including Michael Ozzie Myers, who was a Democratic congressman from Pennsylvania. He went to federal prison, served time, and when he came out, he became what does he know? He knows politics. So he became a political consultant representing candidates. Well, he's about to go to prison again because he just pleaded guilty to I think it was like almost a dozen felony counts of doing what? Bribing the managers of polling places. So these are the people that run polling places in Philadelphia to do what? To stuff fraudulent ballots into the ballot box for his clients. And according to the federal indictment, so I'm not making this up, this is the federal indictment filed by the U.S. attorney there, he did it in multiple elections for multiple candidates. So we don't know how many fraudulent ballots were cast, but they were, and in fact, 2 of the poll managers have already previously pleaded guilty to accepting the bribes to stuff fraudulent ballots into the ballot box. Now, the media has gone from saying there's no election fraud to saying, oh, well, look at the Heritage database. By the way, it's the most visited page on at heritage.org. So now they say, oh, see, it's so rare, we don't need to worry about it. But what you all need to understand is that, for example, it's hard to detect it if you're a state like California, New York, doesn't require an ID to vote. And second, even when it is detective, a lot of local prosecutors have no interest in prosecuting this case. So how much bigger is the problem? Well, I don't know, but I'm going to tell you about two quick reports that give you an example of this. And you tell me what I'm running out of time, okay? Okay. I work at the Heritage Foundation, but I'm on the board of an organization called the Public Interest Legal Foundation. It's a nonprofit, nonpartisan organization interested in election integrity. Florida has really good open records laws. You can demand all kinds of records from local governments there. So here's what we did. We sent an open records request to the 10 biggest counties in Florida, and we asked them for all criminal referrals made by their county election officials to the local DA. So any cases where a local county election official had evidence that fraud had occurred, and they had sent it to the local DA for investigation and prosecution. 9 of the 10 counties wrote back and said, and by the way, fraud connected to the 2020 election. 9 of the 10 counties wrote back and said, we sent 156 referrals to local DAs. We then checked with the DA's offices and we checked local court records. Anybody care to guess how many of those cases were actually investigated and prosecuted by the local DAs? 0. Now, our database of 1,400 would be what, 10% bigger if this had actually been done just in these 9 counties in Florida. The 10th county, Hillsborough County, wrote back and said, oh, even when we find fraud, we never refer it to the local DA for investigation. By the way, that DA in that county was recently removed by Governor DeSantis after he announced that he wasn't going to be enforcing some of the new abortion laws passed by the state. All right, one other example of how big this problem potentially will be. The Public Interest Legal Foundation obtained the statewide voter registration lists from 42 states. We wanted all 50, but there were problems getting the other 8. So we ended up with the statewide voter registration list of 42 states. And we had the voter histories from the 2016 and 2018 elections. We did this in 2020. Now, any officials who are in this room who've run for office know how bad voter registration lists are in the states, how inaccurate they are. You know, you send out campaign literature that comes back saying, there's nobody here at that address, right? Voter registration lists are in really bad shape. So we did something that no state is doing, although Tennessee is about to start doing it because they passed a law allowing it. We supplemented the statewide voter registration lists with commercial data. Credit agencies. Everyone in here would be really shocked at how much credit agencies know about you. Now, why did we do that? Because by using credit agency information, we could supplement the state information and get unique identifiers. We could get the full social security number of the John Smith who's registered to vote at 100 Maple Street. And by getting that unique identifier, that meant that when we compared North Carolina and South Carolina's voter lists, we would know whether the John Smith registered to vote in Charlotte is the same or a different John Smith registered somewhere in South Carolina, like pick whatever town you want, Charleston, okay? Yeah. So we would know whether it's the same person or 2 different people, because you'd be amazed at how many people in this country have the same name, the same birth date. But if you have their full social security number, you're going to know whether it's the same or different person. And then we compared the lists. Remember, we had voting histories, whether they voted in the 2016-2018 election. We found 144,000 cases of potential fraud. 15,000 people who the state said were dead but still voted in the 2016 and 2018 elections. 81,000 people who were registered twice at the same address and voted twice. Election officials didn't detect it. 5,500 people who were registered at different addresses in the same state and voted twice. 8,400 people who voted in 2 states at the same time in 2018. And you'll love this one, 34,000 people who in 2018 voted, but when we checked their addresses, they lived at gas stations, vacant lots, restaurants, etc. Okay? By the way, for folks, I've had folks say to me, okay, so people vote in 2 different states, big deal, it's not gonna, how's it gonna affect anybody? Here, I'll give you another name to Google, Wendy Rosen. Wendy Rosen wanted to be in Congress. And in 2012, she ran for Congress in Maryland. And she won the Democratic primary. She was going to be up in the general election against the sole Republican who's in the state, a guy named Andy Harris. She was not liked within the Democratic Party. In fact, the Democratic Party leadership had wanted somebody else to be the Democratic nominee. So apparently somebody in her own party did opposition research on her and discovered that she has registered and voted in Maryland, which you ought to be able to, you should do if you're a congressional candidate, but at the very same time in multiple elections, she had registered and voted in Florida also. She was forced out of the race. She pleaded guilty to election fraud. The Democratic committee named the new candidate to replace her, who was the person they'd originally wanted. But the point is, election officials neither in Florida or Maryland discovered this. She could have gotten away with this probably for years, except for the opposition research done on her. The key to this is the fact that we have close elections all the time in this country. And it's those close elections at the city level, the town level, even state legislative races, where a little bit of fraud can make the difference. Don't forget, 2 years ago in Iowa, we had a congressional race decided by 6 votes. And the Public Interest Legal Foundation just released another report listing over 500 elections that they counted up in different states that were all a tie vote. So that's where it can really make a difference. Okay, so what do we do about this? Well, requiring an ID to vote in person and absentee is obvious common sense. And despite what the left will tell you, or opponents of this, the American people support this. The polls show overwhelming support. You know, Americans on different sides of the political aisle, man, we disagree sharply on so many issues. You name it, education, abortion, and we disagree. One of the most overwhelming, consistent issues you can see where Americans all agree is voter ID. And keep in mind, every single state that put one in also put in a requirement saying, if you don't already have an ID, we'll provide you one for free. In last year, in the midst of Georgia's passing its election reform, you know, the one that Joe Biden called Jim Crow 2.0, the support rate for voter ID was 77%. After all of that negative publicity about it, a recent poll I saw show it at 84%. So support has actually gone up for it. You need to do things to clean up voter rolls. One of the most obvious ones, and I noticed North Carolina doesn't do this, is, remember, your state, you have a vital records department, right? It keeps track of deaths in the state. Okay, well that's great if you're checking that against your voter list, take off people who have died. But if somebody leaves and dies in another state, your vital records department ain't gonna know that. That's why smart states check their voter list against the Social Security Administration's master death index, because they keep track of deaths all across the country. And if your state's not doing that, it's just dumb not to do it. Okay, the final and third point, because I'm talking too long, I'm sorry about that, is this whole meme you've heard now for the last 10 years about voter suppression. there's no term called voter suppression in federal voting laws. There's all kinds of things that are prohibited in federal law, but there's no such term as voter suppression because it didn't exist past about 10 years ago. You know where that term came from? These liberal groups got focus groups together and tried to come up with, man, what's the worst sounding term that we can use? And they came up with the idea of voter suppression. And they use that anytime anybody proposes any kind of election reform that they don't like. Now, let's talk about the one that they oppose the most, which is voter ID. The first voter ID laws in this country requiring a government-issued photo ID were effective in the 2008 presidential election, Georgia and Indiana. So we now have more than a decade's worth of data. Today, there are 21 states with a photo ID law and 14 states with an ID requirement that also includes non-photo IDs. 2 years ago, the National Bureau of Economic Research released this great study in which they took the turnout from 2008 to 2018, and they compared states with photo ID laws and states with no ID requirement, like New York, California. Want to hear a quote from that report? Voter ID laws, quote, have no negative effect on registration or turnout overall or for any group defined by race, gender, age, or party affiliation. They have no effect. In Georgia, in 2008, their voter ID law was in place for the first time. You know what happened in the general election? They had the largest turnout in their history. And they've had record registration and turnout since there. In fact, in 2008, and I hate to give you a bunch of numbers, but this is really important because the data answers this question. The increase in Democratic turnout in Georgia in 2008 over the prior presidential election, 2004, when there was no ID law in place, it was the 5th biggest increase in Democratic turnout in the entire country. Okay? Bigger than all these states with no ID requirements. The overall turnout, so this is everybody who voted in the general election in Georgia in the 2008 election, it was up 7 percentage points from the 2004 election. It was the 2nd biggest increase in turnout of any state in the country after their ID law went in place. And Georgia is one of the states, few states, that tracks turnout by race. The turnout of black voters with their ID law in place for the first time went up 140% over the prior election. Hispanic turnout was up 42%. White turnout was up 8%. Now, this very same thing happened in Indiana. By the way, Indiana, they passed a photo ID law. It went all the way to the US Supreme Court. And in 2008, the Supreme Court issued an order saying, this is perfectly constitutional. It's not a burden on voters. And so Indiana's law went into effect. By the way, one of the funny things about that case is that, you know, I tell folks that and they'll say, oh, I'm sure it was one of those 5-4 decisions, right? It was those terrible conservatives. It was a 6-3 decision. And the majority opinion was written by Justice John Paul Stevens. Justice John Paul Stevens was one of the liberal stalwarts of the Supreme Court. But when the ACLU was up in front of him arguing, there's no fraud in the country, we don't need this law, they forgot that before he became a judge, you know where he practiced law? Chicago. So trying to convince him fraud doesn't occur didn't help. So Indiana has its photo ID law in place for the first time because the Supreme Court said it's okay. Anybody know who won Indiana in 2008 in the presidential race? Barack Obama. And guess what? He was the first Democratic presidential candidate to win Indiana since the 1960s. And Indiana had the biggest increase in Democratic turnout of any state in the entire nation in the 2008 election. Now, all that sounds like old news, 2008. So let me just give you a couple of recent ones, and then I'll end this. The U.S. Census Bureau issues a report after every election on turnout across the country. It's a great report. I use it all the time. According to the U.S. Census reports, Mississippi, which has a photo ID requirement for all voters, in 2016, 2018, and 2020, so the last 3 federal elections, had higher turnout of its voters than Connecticut, New York, and the president's home state of Delaware. Not only that, but black turnout was higher than white turnout in Mississippi in all 3 of those elections. Georgia, which was attacked by Joe Biden and Stacey Abrams, and Major League Baseball moved its game out. In the last 3 federal elections, 2016, 2018, 2020, they had higher turnout than the state of New York. And black turnout in Georgia in the last 2 federal elections was higher than black turnout in New York. Now, I probably don't need to tell you this because you've probably heard this, but your lieutenant governor, right? First African American ever elected to be lieutenant governor, Mark Robinson. He actually went up to Washington, testified before a House committee a year or so ago. And I just got to read you this one quote from him, okay? But today we hear Georgia law being compared to Jim Crow, that black voices are being silenced and that black voices are being kept out. How? By bullets, by bombs, by nooses? No, by requiring a free ID to secure the vote. Let me say that again, by requiring a free ID to secure the vote. How absolutely preposterous. Are you kidding me? The notion that people must be protected from a free ID to secure their vote is not just insane, it is insulting. And that he is absolutely right about this. Now, the one thing I'll tell you about this is that it's really strange and it's really sad that this has become a partisan issue. Because not so long ago, it was not. It was a bipartisan issue. And the example I'll give you of that is in 2005. You may recall, Jimmy Carter, right, former Democratic president, and James Baker, former Republican Secretary of State under Ronald Reagan, formed a commission on federal election reform. If you look all the way in the very back of the form, you'll see my name there. They even spelled it right, because I was one of the people they consulted on it. But it was a bipartisan commission, okay? It had both Democrats and Republicans on it, and they issued a report making a whole series of recommendations on how to improve American elections, and it included everything from voter ID to cleaner voter rolls. But the best thing in it, and I agree with the recommendations in the report, they said this, and this is the important thing to remember in all of this. Elections are the heart of democracy. They are the instrument for the people to choose leaders and hold them accountable. At the same time, elections are a core public function upon which all other government responsibilities depend. If elections are defective, the entire democratic system is at risk. Thanks.
We're going to have a little bit of time for Q&A. So Aiden here is going to walk around with the mic.
Mr. Ball and Spakovsky, thank you so much for coming and joining us here tonight.
Sure.
You have a very well-spoken nephew, and so hearing you speak tonight, I can see that it's genetic. Now, it seems apparent to me that there is no good answer as to why there is this push to get rid of voter ID in elections, but that's coming from someone who is fairly uneducated. As someone who has investigated this, what is the most solid argument? Is there a solid argument for getting rid of voter IDs? What is that argument, and what is the rebuttal?
Well, the claim on this is that, as I said, is that it suppresses votes. That it's somehow going to keep, for example, black Americans from voting. I will tell you that to me displays I hate to say this, but I think it's true, it displays a patronizingly racist attitude. Because the attitude is that somehow they're not capable of doing this. I don't know if you all know this, but I told you I was an undergraduate at MIT. I used to be on pretty good terms with one of my former professors there, and these days he won't talk to me. You know why? When the Justice Department sued North Carolina over its voter ID law, one of the prior suits, he was brought in as an expert. And I obtained a copy of the transcript. And I could not believe what he was saying in the court case. And in fact, I wrote an article for National Review about it, going after him for it. He actually testified in court that black residents of the state were less sophisticated than white voters and could not handle an ID requirement. I don't know what's more racist than saying that. And I think, like I said, the constituents of those who oppose this have proven them wrong. They turn out to vote. The registration numbers and turnout numbers in states that put an ID requirement has not gone down, it's gone up. And I think, some folks that have a mistaken view on this. They think it's suppressive. It doesn't. I think there are some political consultants, like the ones I cited, the Democratic political consultant who got convicted in Troy, New York, who think this might make it a little more difficult to perhaps engage in wrongdoing in the voting process. But it's a mix of that.
Thank you for your lecture. I don't necessarily hold this opinion, but what would you say to someone who's maybe so discouraged by hearing everything you've put forward about the state of the integrity of our elections, who might not want to vote now because, right. Well, is it even worth it, right? Again, I don't hold that opinion, but if I did, what would you say?
Yeah, that's a mistake. Anybody who thinks, look, it's actually kind of amusing, and again, it tells you how the media works. I've seen all these articles by reporters claiming that I have said why there's mass fraud across the country. I've never said that. What I've said is fraud occurs often enough that we ought to be concerned about it and take steps to stop it. Is there massive fraud going on across the country? No. But it does happen, and we see elections overturned because of it. Does that mean people shouldn't go out and vote? No. Again, I go back to that Iowa race two years ago where a congressional race was decided by 6 votes. That means all they needed was one more vote in 6 precincts out of the thousands in the state, and it would have made a difference in that election. What I tell folks who are concerned about this, I say, you worried about it, then get involved. Get a job as a local poll worker. If you're an official in the polling place, you can make sure everything is being done above board. You don't have time for that? Become a poll watcher. I don't care which party you support, become a poll watcher. And when it comes to improving the election process, look, there's a lot of people that work on this issue who are academicians and lawyers who have no practical experience in administering elections. And what Mary didn't tell you was, yeah, I'm a lawyer, I've enforced federal voting rights laws, but for 5 years, I was a county election official in Atlanta. And for 3 years, I was a county election official in Fairfax County, Virginia. Those are the 2 biggest states, 2 biggest counties in both states. And we used to have monthly public meetings of our county election boards to talk about what was going on. How often do you think any member of the public showed up to monitor what we were doing or ask us questions? They never showed up. And what needs to happen is the same way, as you all know, in the past year or 2, parents have started showing up at school board meetings, asking questions about what's being taught to their kids. The public needs to start showing up at county election board meetings and asking questions. I'll give you an example of one. Remember the statistic I gave you about how we found people who their home registration address were vacant lots? There's no reason for that to happen. What is the biggest thing that county government, what's their number 1 priority? It's collecting property taxes, right? Because that's how they fund county government. So what does that mean? That means that the county tax department, they know every piece of property in a county. You go to the county tax department with any address and they'll tell you, is it a residential property? Is it a commercial property? Is it an industrial property? County election officials, most of them, aren't taking advantage of that. When somebody sends them in a registration form, they ought to take the address the person is listing and go to the county tax department and say, is this a residential address? And if the county tax department says, well, no, it's a gas station, well then, obviously they need to investigate that and find out what's going on. That's basic. It doesn't take state law to do that. The county election officials just need to get off their butts and get to work. And the only way that's going to happen is if people show up and start asking them those questions. By the way, if the county tax department comes back and says, oh no, it's a residential property, the next question the county election official should ask is, what kind of residential property is it? And if the county tax department comes back and says, oh, it's a single-family home, what's the next step that the county election official should take? They should check the county's entire voter registration list and find out how many people are registered to vote at that home. Because if there are 500 people registered at a single-family home, then you know that's a problem. And if you think that doesn't happen, last week we had an event at the Heritage Foundation. And one of the speakers was Senator Paul Betancourt of Texas. He's a state senator. He used to be the county registrar in Harris County, which is one of the largest counties in the state. And what did they discover? They actually discovered a single-family home where there were 500 registered individuals, 140 of whom had voted in an election. Now, that's obviously fraud. But if county election officials aren't taking the kind of basic steps like that, they're not going to discover it. Sorry, this is a very long answer, but it's an important question. Yeah.
It's more of a statement than anything. Rasmussen did a poll in 2021, and they said that in the Washington Examiner that 69% of black voters and 75% overall voters support voter ID laws.
Right.
It's incredible that the Democratic Party is taking up the other side when there really isn't any voice for it.
Yeah, no, they're not listening to their constituents. And they ought to be. Do y'all remember Andrew Young? Andrew Young, for the younger people in the audience, was the mayor of Atlanta. And when Jimmy Carter became president, he appointed him as a UN ambassador. And some years ago, he said, you know, if the folks fighting voter ID would take a fraction of the money they're using to do that and use it to go find the people who don't have an ID to get them an ID, we'd be a lot better off. And he's right about that.
This question is also points to voter ID. So the argument for voter registration, could that be analogous to this voter ID? And could you say that both are, in a sense, voter suppression? And while it does sound scary, couldn't you say that the argument isn't necessarily one that voter ID specifically is a suppression, but anything that is an obstacle to someone's ease of voting is a suppression in a sense? Like you could say that, why doesn't everyone automatically have a registration to vote?
I'm sorry, can you hold the mic a little closer? But somehow
Yeah.
This place is echoey.
I don't know if this is even on, but I guess what I'm saying is registration to vote seems
Right.
to be a hurdle in a sense. So perhaps voter ID is a similar argument. It's saying that it's another hurdle. So how are those two arguments reconciled as saying anything that's a hurdle?
See, one of the biggest things that historians will tell you is that you act in peril if you forget your history. Do anybody know why we have voter registration laws in this country now? It's because there was massive fraud committed in American elections in the 1800s and early 1900s, where, like in the Tammany machine in New York, would bring in huge numbers of individuals to vote in a polling place and then take them to another polling place and have them vote again. And the whole reason we put in voter registration laws was to try to prevent that from happening. So, I mean, anybody who says voter registration is keeping anybody from voting, again, they don't know their facts. It is so easy to register to vote. I mean, there's a federal form, it's one page, that you can download off the internet, print out, you fill it out, and you mail it in. And you can get these forms at almost any government office. And I have a number here. Remember I told you about the census reports? Because I've heard opponents of voter registration say, oh my gosh, this is keeping people from registering and keeping them from voting. The Census Bureau says that in the 2020 election, we had the highest voter registration rate of the prior 5 elections. So the registration has been just going steadily up in our presidential races. And again, there's just no evidence that that keeps people from voting. The other way you know this is something else the Census Bureau does. They actually do a survey after federal elections where they go in and they ask people, they go after people who didn't register and didn't vote. And they ask them, why didn't you vote and why didn't you register? And for all these opponents of these reforms who say it's all these administrative rules that keep people from registering and voting, that's not what the surveys say. Having trouble getting registered is like a tiny percentage of the response. The vast majority of individuals who didn't register and didn't vote say, I didn't like the candidates, I have no interest in politics, I don't think it'll make any difference in my life. And that's a cultural problem. That has nothing to do with the mechanics and the rules and regulations governing elections. Great. Right.
Thank you, Mr. von Spakovsky. I had 2 questions. I'm trying to wrap my head around the data argument you were making, and I was trying to understand you mentioned Illinois and Georgia.
Indiana.
Indiana and Georgia.
Right.
Well, I know you mentioned it at least with Indiana. Indiana and Georgia, how you saw an uptick in black voters after the institution of these voter ID laws. Are those 2 states anomalies in the data?
No.
Or is that, okay, got it.
No,
and
they're
then,
not.
Do those laws demonstrate, do the institution of those laws demonstrate an increase in voter enthusiasm and an increase in voter participation specifically because of the institution of those laws?
Yeah, that's a good question. That's a good question. And when the Supreme Court upheld Indiana's voter ID law, they said 2 things. One, they said this makes sense and it's not a burden on voters any different from having to register to vote. And we need it because what they said specifically was the U.S. has a long, unfortunate history of fraud that's been demonstrated by journalists and historians, and it could make the difference in a close election. But the second thing the Supreme Court talked about was public confidence in elections. And increasing public confidence is very important to getting people to go out to poll. It goes back to your earlier question about will people not vote? And I'll give you a very specific example of this. Some years ago, I know you guys, you heard my name and you said, he's not from around here. Well, that's right, I was born and raised in Alabama, okay? So a couple of years ago, I went down to Greene County, Alabama. That's about 2.5 hours south from Huntsville, where I live. Greene County is one of the poorest counties in the country. It's in what they call the Black Belt of Alabama, which is because of the soil there. Greene County is about, the last time I looked, it was like 75% African American. Okay, it's a one-party county. You know, if you want to run for election and win there, you run the Democratic primary, and whoever wins that wins. In the 1990s, in the middle of the Clinton administration, and I give, Janet Reno was the Attorney General, I give her credit for this. The FBI office in Birmingham got a phone call from a young African-American Democrat who had run for office for county government as a reformer because everybody in the county said, the county government's corrupt. He lost his race, and he called up the Birmingham field office and said, I think my election was stolen. So the FBI opened up an investigation. They were besieged by the NAACP and the Southern Christian Leadership Conference saying, the only reason you're doing this, you're using Gestapo tactics, and the only reason you're doing this is to suppress black voters. The head of the NAACP even demanded and got a meeting with Janet Reno, the Attorney General of the United States in Washington, to persuade her to drop this investigation. The Justice Department did not drop it. They eventually prosecuted and convicted almost a dozen local individuals, most of them county commissioners, including, by the way, the treasurer of the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, who had opposed the whole investigation. Now, I wrote a case study about this, which you can read at the Heritage website. And you know what I did is I checked turnout, what happened to turnout in the county after these prosecutions and after these convictions. Anybody care to guess what happened? Turnout went up. And this was brought home to me by one of the FBI agents who I interviewed when I did this case study, who told me that after the convictions, he got a call from one of the voters that he had interviewed. This was an elderly African-American woman. She had marched in the civil rights movement in Selma, and she thanked the FBI agent for the work they had done, and she said to him that she had gone and voted in the last election because she felt like her vote finally would count. And I think that illustrates very graphically that maintaining and increasing public confidence in the honesty and fairness of the election process is really important. So. All right, so we got one more. This is the final. The mayor gets the final question.
I voted yesterday early.
Right.
Early voted. And my wife did too. And they asked for my ID. I had no problem asking, showing in my ID. Didn't
Right.
have a problem at all doing that. And I think we need to understand that people that go vote should be able to provide some type of identification as to who they are.
Right. No, I agree. By the way, one of the changes that a number of states made, like Georgia and Texas, and this is important, is, look, Georgia and Texas both had very good photo ID law requirements, and turnout went up in both states after the law went in place, despite claims to the contrary. But remember what happened in the 2020 election. We had a huge increase in mail-in balloting, right? So both states changed their laws and amended it to require an ID, not just for in-person, but also for absentee ballots. And they made it very easy for people to comply with it. But that's one of the provisions that the U.S. Justice Department has sued them over. But so far, the Justice Department has not won, has not been able to get an injunction to stop those from being in place. I'll end you with this. Did you all know, like I said, Canada requires an ID, and Mexico, which has a much larger, poor population than us, they not only require a photo ID to vote, they require a photo ID with a thumbprint on it. And they have had no problems since they put that in. In fact, after their ID law went into place, the opposition party in Mexico won the presidency for the first time in like 60 years, and a lot of people credit the fact that they put in an ID requirement for the opposition party finally being able to win. So thanks a lot for having me tonight.
Thanks so much. Thanks everyone for coming out, and thanks so much for Hans von Spakovsky for the talk. And for those of us who are, I guess we'll meet in the back for some of the folks who are going over for dinner with the speaker. For students, I urge you to take the Heritage Foundation internship flyer, and also if you're interested in the ISI chapter, sign up with Nicholas and Youthen. Thanks.
Yeah, and if they run out of flyers, it's the Young Leaders Program. You go to the website and you can find it.